Hi there, it's Proteus Astrology, and I'm going to pose the question, when is a muse not a muse? So this is a meditation on a theme presented as a visual essay. I'm going to be adding audio and video as well to see how that works. It may not be polished, but I'm still learning these skills. And I never know where the topic will lead, so I'm starting with a film review of a film called Muse, and it's going to lead us into different territory and across different subjects. And just to say before we start out that I'm the type that will watch any horror film. I would stand looking into the night just like this. If it has supernatural content, even better. I adore the genre of horror. I can't really explain why. I just like it. And I have a whole list of favourites, one or two of which I will mention. I'm very lenient also if in a horror film it veers too much towards gore, though I don't like gore. Or if it kills off the characters in the first half an hour, or it has too many wacky sound effects, I'll still persist until the end. But if it loses its way because of the script, that really bothers me. And so this film, Muse, directed by Jaume Balaguerro in 2017, didn't really make my flesh creep, except what did was to see that these were not the muses that I recognized. So basically any film with the title Muse would grab my attention. But can it keep my attention? I don't know. But if you like blood and interior so dark you can barely see, then it might have something for you. It has oodles of blood, some naked female flesh, and even a flash of Dr. Samuel Solomon, that's Elliot Cowan, naked in bed, while his seductive young lover does something nasty to her wrists in the bathroom. From there it thrashes forward at a breakneck pace, which just serves to ramp up the suspense in case we might not be feeling any. Cowan plays a literature professor at Trinity College Dublin, more like a California slacker than a professor of literature. So real academics might pause to think first and be cautious before jumping into bed with the first pushy student who jumps into their car on the way home. But it seems Dr. Solomon does not pause to think at all, because he is possessed by this spirit of the muse. So a few of the complex issues just get brushed aside. But I think it is interesting because it's based on this idea that her name is actually Beatrice, so that reminds the professor of the story of Dante and Beatrix, his idealized love, whom he never really consummated with. It's a journey into the spirit of love, as Beatrix was the muse in Dante's Inferno. And I've been studying the muses for quite a while, and thought that they were filled with light and poetry and inspiration, but here they are, as dark as they come. And that kind of jarred with me, so I had to think about that. And it may feel a bit odd, but I wanted to speak on their behalf as if they've been misrepresented somehow. But they do have both inspirational light and dark aspects. And none of this is necessary really, because I can think of a great film, The Vanishing, which is called Spoorloos in Dutch, made in 1988, so not the remake, which was terrible, where all the tension builds up inexorably to its deadly climax, without any crash bang wallop. It's all slow burn and psychological setup, so I kind of miss that in films. The trouble with Muse that it tries to cram everything in, a bit of a thriller and horror and supernatural all at the same time. Don't get me wrong, that can be done. I mean, Rocky Horror Show is a great example. They threw everything in the kitchen sink in there, including romantic comedy and science fiction. But the thing that goes best with horror is just comedy, not necessarily a thriller. Um, so one of the things that bugged me about this film as well, it was totally dark interiors. You could barely make out what was going on. So there's this savage murder that happens where Rachel, played by Anna Oluro, who's a stripper, but who also has nightmare dreams about dead bodies. She ends up stabbing a trafficker in the neck, and then, but it's instantly forgotten. His body is left lying in a pool of blood on the kitchen floor. It's as if the director is saying, well, he was bad, wasn't he? So he doesn't deserve to be rescued or taken to hospital. But that's not to say there aren't interesting things in the film. They take off into this eerie, fairy-infested landscape of Ireland, and the evil muses are demanding a dragon's egg, so it did keep my attention going. I did feel, though, that it just could have been slightly different. This evil muse was new to me, and so I had to look into it. It's based on this book by Jose Carlos Somoza, the Lady 13, number 13, and about 7 evil muses. And he's a Cuban author. And the idea is that Liana Shi is a kind of evil muse who gives the poet great words and great writing, but they have to sign a pact almost with the devil. So you have to lose your life so that the muse could live hers in a supernatural way. It's just, but that's not how it works in real life. I didn't feel, much as I like horror and especially supernatural, the mingling of literary references with the hardcore thriller and sex trafficking murders didn't quite work for me. But there were too many loose ends, and I was thinking, what now? All the way through. So if you know the mythology of the muses, there are 9, and there's a significance to that number, which is esoteric, and that's important to me. So I think there's a whole other mythology of the muses, which has them numbered as 7. But I couldn't help thinking that might be just to echo Fincher's film Seven, so to hint at the 7 deadly sins. People seem to forget that there are 7 virtues as well, but virtues are not easy to make very sexy in a film. So I think the effort here was to create the muses with an evil twist and to make them purely evil. But I believe that the muses have an honor code, so they're not just evil for evil's sake. So I couldn't help wondering what Somoza was thinking. But, while poetry is an overarching metaphor of creativity, the muses had multiple skills that ranged from music to architecture, astrology, astronomy, dance, comedy, tragedy, drama, and one is related to eros, so only one, which is about sex, and that is possibly the one that could lead to madness. The fact that it's set in Ireland should give us the clue. So in Ireland, the concept of the muse is from this idea of the Liana Shi. So it could be just a different way to interpret their function. But this is where we get a fork in the road between the classical light-filled Greek muses and this more evil manifestation. So I'll just give a little bit of background on the muses, the Greek version, before we go back to the Irish version. I made this little zine, which is just a little way of folding out the images of the muses. So there are 9, and they're usually frolicking, dancing, singing, happy as consorts of Apollo. So you get Calliope, the epic Erato, the love muse, Euterpe, the muse of music, Clio, the muse of history, and you get Melpomene, the muse of tragedy, Thalia, the muse of comedy, Terpsichore, the muse of dance, Polyhymnia, the muse of the sacred, and Urania, the muse of astronomy and astrology. And I think what's great about the Greek version is that they bestow inspiration if writers appeal to them, but they warn only one thing, which is not to compete. But this version of the Muse is more related to the idea of the succubi, the famous spirit from Gothic novelists. These are ghostly entities posing as lovers who have sex with you in dreams. And incubi are the male variety. And in Fuseli's painting, it shows one lurching over the body during the night. And the introduction of blood meant that they steer the concept of a muse or some lover, infernal lover, into vampire territory. And that could just be where we misunderstand this broad category of energy vampire. People forget that blood is symbolic and represents all kinds of different resources. Could be money, could be your depletion of energy, not just the blood. So, but if you have ever met one of these, you would definitely know about this, that they can indeed suck your life force and leave you completely diminished. And it's very interesting to see that in the folk legends of Ireland, there's also a male version of the Lianan She, which is the Cancona, who is a love talker. So when you get love bombed, you will know who these people are, because they love bomb their victim and then proceed to gaslight them. So it's a kind of vampire. So I can see where this is leading, that yes, there's a kind of vampiric element, just without the obvious fangs and cloak. So back to Muse, the film. Lianan She appears as a young attractive girl who is also cruel, but extracts the life as a sacrifice or an inspiration for the work of the author. It's a trade-off, and embedded in the lines of Euripides, who said, "Those whom the gods destroy, they first make mad." But I think there is even a minor subplot in this film that you might completely miss, is that Dr. Salomon himself is a kind of vampire to his colleague, played Susan, who played by Franca Potenti, and she gazes at him longingly, and that's no collegial camaraderie to me, but it's completely brushed aside. It's not part of the plot really, but he treats her as he might treat a much thumbed through phone book. Find this for me, find that for me. She obliges more than just an adoring friend would. So he, in a way, I think, is unwittingly the obsession that leaves her with a broken heart. The other thing that struck me is that in the poster you have this phrase, the words can kill. So this is really ramming home the fear button. Sure, words can kill, but they can also heal. And poetry especially reaches hidden depths and can be very therapeutic to the psyche. So the idea of repeating great lines of poetry here is used in a sinister way, almost as a tool of advertising at its worst, which is to associate them with evil and fuse the trauma with those words. So I'm not sure about that. This could subliminally put people off reading Milton, Dante, Shakespeare and all the other great poets, because the beautiful words have been gained from a contract with these succubus-like entities. So now we go to this other book by Brian O'Sullivan, called simply The Irish Muse, but previously the editions had the word Lianan She in it, but he decided to remove it because, according to O'Sullivan, he says that W.B. Yeats went overboard in his description of the fairy folk, saying, this act of so fraudulently portraying the Lianan She as an Irish Gaelic mythological concept seemed to trigger no sentiment of guilt, because there was never really any mention of Lianan She in Ireland before the 20th century, until Yeats came along and mentioned it. And he was thinking more of this English concept related to the dark muse of poets like Keats. So Sullivan is basically saying that Yeats did not allow anything as trivial as facts to get in the way of a good story, and basically created this concept himself. So O'Sullivan goes on to mention that this concept of the fairy mistress as vampire concubine was filtered through the lens of Yeats's approach towards women in his own life. But unfortunately, it is disseminated across the internet, starting with the Wikipedia article in which O'Sullivan says there's hardly a single correct fact. But so I don't know. I mean, there may be some other etheric reality to these creatures. But knowing Yeats's work with the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, you could argue that he actually conjured up these entities as a romantic fantasy of his own and added a dash of malevolence. Just because he could. Poets, remember, are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. And if the Lian and Shi didn't exist before, they do now. He perhaps released them into the world, like Crowley released the Loch Ness Monster, according to some stories. So some, especially O'Sullivan, actually blame Yeats for inventing Lian and Shi. So Lian and Shi, I think, seem to me to have more in common with the Moirae or the Fates, who are fearsome enough already. So you have three of them. One is called Clotho, who's the spinner. The other one is called Lachesis, who is the allotter. And the third one is called Atropos, who is the clipper. And these three decide on the fate of people. And an interesting thing is, if you study Muse asteroids or asteroids in general, you can find these asteroids in your horoscope because they have been named, and it's interesting to see where they are in the chart. So now we come to the culprit, Yeats himself. I'm sorry that I've kept all the astrologers waiting for this bit. Let's look at the astrology of this poet. So William Butler Yeats was born in 1865, which I find very interesting because that is around the time that all the Muse asteroids were discovered. Neptune was in Pisces then, just as it is now. Perhaps you could say heralding a new age in creativity and confusion and moral turpitude. This may be the reason we are talking about this subject now, where the boundaries between the divine, the human, and the lower demonic elemental forces becomes very messy. So his chart has been talked about endlessly elsewhere. So just very quickly, he was quite airy with an Aquarius ascendant and a moon in Aquarius. He was born on the 13th of June, making him a Gemini. Mercury is in Gemini as well, which is great for writers, giving wings to his words. It's also a great signature of a poet, but I think could have made him quixotic and changeable. Bit of the trickster in Mercury there. Uranus is strong next to the Sun, so he was unpredictable, adding to that flavor. That's Uranus at the most difficult degree too. So there's a hefty looking T-square of Venus conjunct Pluto with Mars and the Moon, which is anything if not volatile, and accounting for his dissatisfactions in love, probably. The Mars opposite the Moon also would have the tendency for his words to fire up people's spirit. So whatever else you think of him, I think you can claim that he managed to get across this magical liminality in his poems that still resonates today. We have phrases that everyone recognizes, like mere anarchy is loosed upon the world, the ceremony of innocence is drowned. Everyone recognizes these lines from the poem The Second Coming. And so maybe he did pay the price for that longevity in his work through suffering in life. Hard to say. But there's so much more to a chart than this quick thumbnail. I mean, I'm just skimming over here. He may very well have been fated to bring attention to the lost history and spirituality of Ireland as well, with his book. But I think whether you are beset by muses, good or bad, fate still weaves its way into life in very mysterious ways and can have devastating or demoralizing or very uplifting effect. And just to look quickly at Yeats's actual Muse asteroids, because I think this gives us clues as to what triggered his poetry, or any writer really, to look at their asteroids. And he has Erato, the muse of love, and Clio, the muse of history, conjunct his moon in Aquarius. So I think there's a combination there that's quite interesting. Thalia, the muse of comedy, and Sappho, who was the 10th muse, who created a very intimate, personal voice in poetry, are conjunct his Pluto in Taurus. So I think that strikes me as interesting. He also had Harmonia, which is the kind of musical asteroid, conjunct Uranus. I think, underscoring that very independent spirit, but also these memorable lines that we've mentioned, used to this day. It's full of Irish lore. But since the woman he most admired, Maud Gonne, refused him many times, knowingly saying that his unhappy rejections and longing for people just out of reach made for great poetry. And she also said that the world would thank her for causing that to happen. It could have been also an aphrodisiac to him. He even proposed to her daughter, Iseult, but she too turned him down. So he was a man of many times refused. But perhaps Maud Gonne was right after all. Now we have the legacy of the poetry. So after decades of being rebuffed and still feeling frisky in old age, Yeats wrote in his usually metaphoric style, but raw and direct and modern. But he also used astrological symbolism, so the astrologers will know what this means. The moon speaks of strange attractions, the timid sun of failing prowess, and centaurs would be Chiron, but this is long before Chiron was discovered. Yeats read in a style he called elevated chanting, so I'm not sure if I can do it justice, as it's quite bardic, but here goes. Lines in dejection. When have I last looked on the round green eyes and long wavering bodies of the dark leopards of the moon, and all the wild witches, those most noble ladies? For all their broomsticks and their tears, their angry tears are gone. The holy centaurs of the hills are vanished. I have nothing but the embittered sun, banished heroic mother's moon and vanished. And now that I have come to 50 years, I must endure the timid sun. So instead of Yeats, we might also turn to Robert Graves, who wrote a work on the Greek myths called The White Goddess, which is also popular and famous. I'm not sure that it's a more accurate account, but it contains the history of female deities and the ignored traditions. But he was another muse-obsessed poet. Many say this work, The White Goddess, is high on poetic logic but low on historical accuracy. Poets remember thinking poetic ways, and academia doesn't like that, so it's best to make your own mind up. And incidentally, Robert Graves wrote a story called The Shout, which was made into a film in 1978 that starred Alan Bates, John Hurt, Susanna York, and Tim Curry. I think that translated really well into an atmospheric tale of the supernatural, and one I'd recommend to watch, as it is genuinely disturbing, using psychology to build its suspense, yet it still retains a kind of elusive meaning. So Yeats's idea of a malevolent muse might be fictional, and it's only true at the poetic level, and only if poets die young and write their most brilliant work before doing so. But when I think about it, the fact is that a lot of poets lead very ordinary lives. For example, W.H. Auden, or even non-entities like Fernando Pessoa and Philip Larkin, who deliberately depersonalize themselves. But one question to ask is whether Ted Hughes was the reverse male muse for Sylvia Plath. Hughes was a Leo and Plath a Scorpio, so they were both fixed in their ways. Yet she said she was able to draw upon a single shared mind. It is just that this mad form of the muse is maybe rarer than we think, or is it? There's the case of T.S. Eliot as well. He had a wife, Vivian Haywood, who was sectioned and who always believed that his best work was inspired by her. She was a writer too, but that didn't stop him being the most loved poet during World War II, even though Vivian did appear to behave a little bit like this Lian and Shi archetype through her unfortunate bipolar condition. I mean, she was treated very harshly for that, as it wasn't recognized for what it actually was. And another case might be Paul Verlaine and Arthur Rimbaud. So clearly the muse is not just female. Verlaine was Aries and Rimbaud was a Libra, so there was a cardinal force at loggerheads there, which turned out to be super intense and explosive. I think I might need a whole other essay to delve into this, but another great case story is that of Oscar Wilde and Bosie, another tragic muse gone wrong story. So I realize now that I've come to the end of this exploration that I may have only succeeded in achieving the opposite of what I intended, which is that you might want to go and see the film, which is fine, as you may have a completely different view than I have. But in the process, in the journey, I've discovered that the deeper you go into a subject, the more complex it becomes. And someone whose opinion I rate highly actually loved the film, but that doesn't change how uncomfortable I felt watching it. I want my muses to be divinely inspired, not lecherous demonic vampires. But maybe that resides totally in the minds of the artists, whether it goes in one direction or the other. Like the famous story of the wolf, which one do you feed? So if you do get around to watching it, let me know what you think and say whether that worked for you. So that's all for now. Thank you for listening. If you had the patience to get this far, you're doing well. Please check my website, which is www.proteusastrology.co.uk, and may all your muses be divine.